Welcome, everybody. I'm Robert Nelson. I'm the program manager for the Grants Collective and the co-host for Impact and Coffee, which is a thrice monthly, first 3 Tuesdays of the month, networking group for nonprofit organizations here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's usually held at the Albuquerque Community Foundation over on Tijeras in downtown Albuquerque, but of course, because we're going through this really difficult time with the coronavirus, we're all doing it virtually. And so I know I introduced everybody earlier, but raise your hand if you're a part of the Impact and Coffee team. Thank you so much for all of your hard work for putting this together. And thank you to all of our panelists who joined us here today. So just a brief intro. And I don't have everyone's bios, I'm not gonna do that. But we made sure that we had that on our Facebook and everything like that. So Marisa Magallanes is from the Albuquerque Community Foundation. Thank you, Marisa, for being here today. Sipora, and I'm just going on the order that is on my screen, left to right. So this has nothing to do with like names or alphabetical or anything like that. Sipora Nepesh is our next person. She's the executive director for New Mexico Thrives, our local coalition chapter of nonprofits. Ali Sanchez over at the Grant Plant and the Grants Collective. Hi, Ali. Thank you so much for being here. Terry Bruner, the CEO for the Grants Collective, is here today. And the executive director for the New Mexico Association of Grantmakers, Cathy Fry, is here today. Hi, Cathy. So today, what we're going to have is a conversation about, well, the coronavirus, or as this event is titled, Nonprofit Life in the Time of Corona, or in the time of COVID-19, excuse me. And so a really nice little take on Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but not as romantic or long-winded for that matter. If you've read that book, I love that book. It's not, yeah, just wanted to be literary today. So what we're going to talk about today in a lot of ways is just taking in a lot of our panelists' expertise and also just seeing what is going on with the nonprofit landscape going on right now. And so we have about an hour to talk through some questions here. We have about 5 or 6 that we're going to get through with some follow-ups in between. And so our first question is, I know this has been a really challenging time for a lot of organizations. What effects have you seen on those organizations and nonprofit, even government, and have you seen in the sector in the past few weeks? And I'm going to start with Sipora.
So in the past few weeks, nonprofits have had to pivot very quickly from doing business as usual and operating in their offices or facilities to work remotely. And some people have not been able to deliver services because of the kind of services they need. Other organizations are considered essential services, and so they are trying to figure out or have had to figure out very quickly how to operate safely under the current health emergency. So we've seen a wide range of responses. Some nonprofits have temporarily closed, laying people off. Others are adapting and trying to deliver services remotely. We know that food banks are stretched to the limit and their volunteer numbers are down, and because of the panic shopping, they are having difficulty getting food to provide to people. So there's a number of different challenges all happening all at once.
Well, and knowing that, you know, this is kind of, the pandemic itself is not new. Like we've had other kind of health kind of illnesses pop up over the last few years, but nothing really like this where it spread so quickly. But knowing that, like this kind of emergency that's happening right now, like what can we glean from past emergencies that this nation has faced? And this opens up to a lot of other people as well.
I'll go with sort of the most recent similar funding and grant seeking incident that we had, which is the recession of 2008 and 2009, and just tell you what we experienced at the Grant Plant and saw with our clients. To sort of sum it up, we saw a lower award rate, bigger average awards, and more government funding. So as we see the response come from the federal, state, county, even city levels to meet emerging needs and to try to get the economy to mitigate impacts and then eventually do recovery, we'll see more coming through from those government sources. We'll also see what we saw last time was an emphasis on speed. So if we look at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was the sort of cornerstone stimulus package back in 2008 and 2009, a word or a phrase you saw over and over and over again was shovel-ready projects. So we have both at the local level for smaller foundations, emergency funding coming through for quick deployment. And once we start seeing these government funding coming through, a lot of them are going to have that same emphasis on the ability to just go ahead and start actually doing the work. So fewer abilities to do like planning periods and that sort of thing. What we also saw was a spread in foundation funding, which I think we're seeing the seeds of so far, of doing a lot of smaller awards to a lot larger group of foundations. So trying to kind of spread stabilizing funding across a greater group amount of groups. I think we'll also see some redirecting and flexibility going on in public and private grant seeking, as some programs, as Sephora was mentioning, can't continue the way they've been done, or organizations have a greater need for just sheer operational funding as opposed to programmatic funding. So a little bit of pivoting going on the funder side. And I would say finally, that we'll also probably, we saw in 2008 and 2009, and we'll probably see again, is some of bigger awards, whether they're going to pre-selected agencies or agencies with a larger regional or national footprint, just some monster awards from the bigger foundations and larger awards coming through from state foundations that are trying to really address some of the systemic needs.
Cathy, can you speak to thanks, Allie. I really appreciate that response. There's a lot that was going on back in recession, but I also just want to talk about foundations too. Cathy, what do you see that's happening with the foundations and their response time going on right now? Cathy, you're on mute. We're going to unmute you. There you go.
First of all, Robert, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate on this call. This is really timely and very important. And I'm delighted to be able to respond to private philanthropy. We represent several hundred private foundations across the state, and we're also a part of our national network of philanthropy serving organizations. So I can tell you that, like many of you, there's just a lot of information that's being shared among and between philanthropic organizations. Just today, there was a conference call put on by the Council of Foundations for their member organizations. So everybody is really trying to stay connected and to communicate so that we're all coordinated in our efforts. In New Mexico, which is the group that our organization represents, we are also mobilizing and organizing our funders to coordinate and connect with our grantees, with other funders, and with communities across the state. Robert, did you want me to go into this further at this point, or should I just wait until we get to our question?
We'll wait till we get to our question here in a second. That's really good. I wanted to kind of pivot to Terry and just kind of ask the question about what does the funding landscape look like, knowing but the stimulus package passed late last night, and I've just barely gotten through the list myself and seeing some of the totals for some of the push throughs and some of the department stuff. But could you talk about what that means for our state, and how can we what does that landscape look like right now, and what does that mean for us in New Mexico?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, this stimulus, this is the third stimulus package that's gone through, and this is the one that kind of has the most stuff in it for communities and has the broadest reach of all the stimulus efforts they've tried so far. There is a rumor that there's going to be a fourth stimulus in a month or so that is going to fill any gaps that they missed in a sense. But what you're seeing right now is very similar to the Recovery Act of 2008. And that is, it's not creating a lot of new programs. It's expanding existing programs and maybe broadening the eligibility or the terms of those programs. And that's really kind of the easiest way for government to stimulate the economy and increase program output. It's a lot easier than trying to create new programs. So, across the board, I'm looking at my list. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here that's very beneficial to the nonprofit community. The Child Care Development Block Grant is getting a push up in money. The Head Start Emergency Staffing Program, there's a lot of Head Starts that I imagine are suffering. The Community Services Block Grant Program got a boost in funds. The LIHEAP program, which is the energy and heating program for lower income folks. The Economic Development Administration got more than $1 billion to expand their programs on economic recovery. So there's just a ton of stuff in here. And, our communication to nonprofits is to watch these programs you like, watch for the regulations to come out, for them to advertise this on their website. I know with the Community Services Block Grant, which helps people in poverty, they've already started to put up their definitions of what they're going to do with this extra influx of money. So, so there's a lot in this. Like Robert just said, it's over 1,000 pages total, this legislation. So there's a lot to pick through. The governor, I should mention that the states have a lot of discretionary funds that are coming their way. So there's a big set of funding for discretionary Department of Education monies for schools that the governors will have control of. The Community Development Block Grant, 50 states will share $1 billion in expanding that program. So the two other things I would just mention about the funding to keep in mind is there's a lot in this bill around compliance. So on the Small Business Lending Program, it sets up a committee just to do oversight on these extra small business loans and nonprofit loans. And we learned this again in the 2009 stimulus bill, that compliance is really key. This is not a giveaway. You have to track your expenses. You have to do the paperwork. They're going to be better about it than they were in the first stimulus 10 or so years ago. But compliance is going to be a big deal. And then it's so if you're a nonprofit moving through this crisis at the moment, track your expenses, track what happens to you, track the impact that it has, so you can report back. And those that are prepared and have taken the time to do that, I think could take advantage of these funds. But they're not just going to simply show up on your doorstep. You're really going to have to, work to get them in a sense. But there is a lot of money flowing New Mexico's way.
Thanks, Terry. I really appreciate that. I think I had Siri just kind of click on. Hold on a second. Sephora, I noticed that so the Council of Nonprofits released their analysis this morning, and I noticed that in the bill, in the stimulus package itself, there's language around like the charitable deductions. Like, how is that different from what we've seen in the past?
So prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, people were allowed to claim a charitable deduction that would reduce their overall taxable income. When that bill passed, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, they made the basic deduction so high that an individual or a couple would need to give, I believe it's $12,000 to get any tax benefit from a charitable donation. So this is language for an above the line deduction, which means anybody making a donation between March 1 and the end of December 2020 can claim up to $300 off their taxable income. And I know that there is an effort in the next bill to get that raised even higher.
That's good to know. Do you think, you know, with all the, like with the stimulus package and with other foundations, do you think this will change how we do business as nonprofits?
Life has changed, and the way we do business as nonprofits is changing day by day and almost hour by hour. So we are not going back to status quo. It will be different moving forward, and how different is partly up to us. And so I think as a nonprofit sector, we need to be thoughtful and proactive. So part of that being proactive is going after the funding and not leaving it on the table. So so we get as much input, as much inflow of that money as we can. And I think we need to be talking with our state representatives and senators about thoughtful infrastructure investment. Part of the problem when nonprofits were told to go home and operate remotely is that New Mexico has many areas that don't have internet access. And so it's simply not possible to do things remotely.
Not for everybody, for sure.
Not for everybody, certainly.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the hard part, especially with rural New Mexico. Terry, I noticed that there was a lot of rural development in that big long list. Do you think, how can we, I guess, do you know how much is coming in New Mexico, or do you think, like, how can we marshal rural communities to get or access some of that funding?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of goes back to this broadband point. You know, in the 2009 stimulus period, you know, I was with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We had to set up, I think it was 10 computer stations in the office for people to come in and do the application and compliance stuff. There's going to be expectations now that everybody can do that online. Paper applications will be, you know, kind of no longer in practice. So that will be a strain on rural communities that don't have the capabilities to do this type of work online with the federal government. But yeah, there's, I think, 25 million put in this bill for distance learning and telemedicine through the USDA. There's an extra amount of funding for rural businesses and grant programs for rural business assistance. And I know that on the USDA side, there's a ton of stuff in there on food nutrition as well. But what we have to do with rural communities and rural nonprofits is really help them step up their game so they can compete for these funds. There's not a lot of technical assistance providers in the state that can go to that local food pantry in a small town and help them, you know, fill out the application and get in that federal funding game. So we've made recommendations to the state that they increase their capacity building and technical assistance side around this recovery and deploy people into the rural communities to do, as you might say, like the hand-holding side of this and help people into these programs. I think that's going to be crucial, or New Mexico, again, is going to miss out on some of this money.
So the one thing, and I know this might be too much into a rabbit hole, but with the stimulus funding, and even my next question, the kind of follow-up question is like, what, you know, other than the stimulus stuff, what other funding is available right now to kind of help nonprofits weather this crisis?
Well, I think, I mean, I'll kind of let a couple other people go, but real quick, I know some foundations, I mean, on the non-federal side, there's already emergency funds cropping up on the foundation side. The feds won't be as quick But the foundation community locally has been pretty quick on that. I know some of you might know about that.
Ali, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think we're already seeing emergency funds pop up, especially with community foundations and United Way's leading the way. So there's a number of those that are already going. Albuquerque Community Foundation with United Way of Central New Mexico is already making awards. So we're seeing a bunch of emergency funds pop up. We're also seeing some national ones. A good way to keep track of these, I know that the Grant Plant, we have kind of a running list going on our website. Candid is, which is the merger between GuideStar and Foundation Center. Our foundation directory is also maintaining a national list with some state funding, as well as showing how those are getting dispersed, which is some interesting intelligence. But we're seeing those joint efforts coming through quickly, and I think we're going to start seeing redirected funds. I've talked to a couple foundation folks who maybe they had an event where they annually give out a bunch of small grants, and so instead they can't do that event because they can't have groups of people together. So oftentimes they're redirecting those into pots of emergency funding.
Exactly. Well, and that just cues it up specifically for Marisa with the Albuquerque Community Foundation. Marisa, how can nonprofits access emergency funding during this time, and what do they need to apply?
So, as mentioned earlier, we partnered with United Way to create the emergency fund for this crisis. And I think the most important thing that we thought about and realized was that, nonprofits are dealing with so much stress as they're looking at, what is coming down the road, adapting, scaling up for services. So we wanted to make the applications really simple and know that it needed to be flexible. And so we created a really simple application that's online. We made our first round of grants last Friday. To date, we've raised about $300,000 with lots of different partners and individual contributors here in the greater Albuquerque area. And I will echo or say that I know Santa Fe Community Foundation has also made their first round of funding. And I think it's been wonderful to see the Community Foundation partner with United Way and come out pretty quick out of the gate in a response. And know that there's an urgency to get funds out right now, but also think a little bit long term and say how we don't know how long this is going to last, and we need to be flexible in how we're supporting nonprofits to do this. So I think flexibility was the key, and simple and quick. And so nonprofits can apply for the Community Foundation's partnership with United Way. And that program specifically, they'll apply every week. There's a panel that meets, reviews applications. If a group is unfunded, they stay in the mix, and that panel convenes every week. Groups are welcome to update the application if there's something that has changed significantly in their response or their need to scale up. And so we're just trying to be really fluid and responsive to what organizations are facing now and how and be quick about it as well.
Marisa, does that, does the funding criteria, I haven't read all the details yet, but does it cover operating, like general operating, or is it, or is it just all?
Where funds are most needed. So we really didn't want to put any programmatic restrictions or anything on this. And so we wanted to keep it, again, as flexible as possible. And that's another thing that, independent of the emergency fund, the foundation has adopted, is that organizations that are currently funded from one of our traditional fields of interest that may be facing a massive change or need for resources in other areas, we're completely encouraging conversations with us to look at how we might adapt what the program we may have funded to another area or to operations. So we just know that these times are unlike any other, and we need to be completely responsive to what those nonprofits need. I don't think I answered your question about eligibility. So the fund, particularly as we started this, was looking at events that were facing loss of revenue or costs that wouldn't be able to be recovered. And we quickly saw that, I think what somebody said earlier, the scale up idea. And so we wanted to make sure that the application reflected that. So it's really looking at loss of revenue on one side and need to scale up to provide services in this time on another. So The criteria is very wide open. We are looking at smaller organizations particularly, but that's not precluding larger organizations from applying.
Robert, this might be a good segue to follow up on the really terrific response from the Albuquerque Community Foundation, also United Way of Central New Mexico. But we organized a funder call last week. We had 90 participants that represented at least 30 funders who came together to talk about what was philanthropy's response in New Mexico and how we could be more coordinated in our work. And so, yes, the community foundations have set up emergency funds. In addition to the Albuquerque Community Foundation, the Santa Fe Community Foundation has a COVID-19 response fund, emergency fund. They have quite a few local partners that they're working with. The Los Alamos Community Foundation has set up just this week a nonprofit emergency response fund. The Taos Community Foundation has a COVID-19 response fund. So we're seeing a lot of the community foundations come together. And then just today, the governor announced a new initiative in partnership with the Coalition of Community Foundations. It's called the All Together New Mexico Fund. Right now, there are 1.1 million in contributions coming from the private sector. This is being coordinated with the Coalition of Community Foundations across the state. Specifically, the funds are designed to go to food and medical needs in communities across the state, childcare for frontline healthcare workers in particular, but others as well, and then income insecurity. So those are some of the emergency funding that's being released and is available now. I would say some of the private independent family and other foundations are also supporting efforts for the community foundations by contributing to their relief efforts. But they're also setting aside some discretionary funding for both grantees, but also for new nonprofit partners that they're serving. They're trying to free up their funds to be able to disseminate that to emergency needs. And so there's a lot going on. The New Mexico Association of Grantmakers, as a convening entity, has created a webpage on our website, which is nmag.org, nmag.org, under our resource tab. And what we're trying to do on behalf of funders across the state is to have one place where people can go to access resources from private philanthropy. But also, we're also hosting national funder resources and business loan and other government funding support. So philanthropy is really stepping to the plate, both in releasing funds in support of their grantees and nonprofit organizations across the state, but they're also trying to partner with business and with government, either augmenting or matching resources, or in other ways trying to support the needs in a rapid response format. So lots going on, but I think people can find a lot of that on the NMEG site, and it's under the resource tab.
That's really helpful. I really appreciate a lot of that information. The team is actually texting back and forth, so I just wanted to make sure I asked a follow-up question. So do you anticipate changes in philanthropic giving over the next year due to stock market losses?
Is that question to me?
Yeah. And actually to most of the panel too, all of the panel too.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from others as well, but I think that funders, at least I can speak on behalf of those groups that I work with, this is not the time to hold back, even though things are happening economically. I think in general, funders feel like they do not want to cut back. Now is not the time. They need to free up funds. They need to release their discretionary funds in support of these emergency needs. So I can't say as a whole what will happen, but I can tell you what funders are thinking. They want to step to the plate and be available for their grantees and also for nonprofit partners across the state.
That's helpful.
I've been on that.
And just to sorry, go ahead, Allie.
Oh, I was just going to say, if we look at 2008 and 2009 as an example, even though we saw some foundations that closed and foundation assets and endowments took big hits, what we saw was a little bit of a drop nationally in grant making, 2% or so, versus these much larger drops in the actual assets. So foundations really do step up. And I think when we look at 2008 and 9, at that point, we were looking generally at just an economic crisis. And now we're looking both at an economic crisis as well as a health crisis with the potential for exponential impacts. So I think Cathy's absolutely right that, it's a bit of the, if not now, then when it comes to preserving or looking forward with those endowments. So I expect that we will see more than 5% coming out from some of those awards. Deeply caring about the community, listening to their constituents, I expect that we will indeed see a lot of that coming through.
And this question is for everybody in the panel. So how do you recommend nonprofits approach grant makers for flexibility with their existing grants?
I can start with that. Just from, we're in the middle of competitive grant season at the foundation now. We've completed our first round. We've had to extend our second round a little bit due to everything. But I think the best thing we can do is be upfront that we want to ease those restrictions. On a programmatic side, we'd love to have those conversations with organizations on a case-by-case basis, but I think just being highly accessible and welcoming that conversation first and foremost. Speaking to several nonprofits that I've worked with in the past, just knowing their hesitancy to say, if we don't produce this program later or this event later, what's going to happen to our funding? And my number one piece of advice is talk to your funder now. Let them know what's happening, how you see things shifting, how you're adapting. And it has to be a two-way conversation led by the nonprofits. And we, I think, have a huge responsibility to be flexible to them in this situation.
So around that, and one of the things we see at the collective a lot of the time is whenever we see, and even in the grant plan side, we'll go through United Way grants or McCune grants or anything like that, and we'll hear from folks who got rejection letters, and then we'll go to another and ask so is there a way for another funder to cover some of those? What is the plan or the contingency around our local foundations to help cover some of the asks around our state, especially in this time? I agree, we should not be holding back in any way, but I know that there's definitely a shift in some of the priorities and how can we actually cover a lot of those priorities going forward.
I think in general, we found that most of the local foundations, corporate, private, community, have been generally receptive and encourage people to ask questions like, I understand that you're not able to fund this. Do you know who will? And making those connections, especially at a time like this, normally they're great at that. So I think that's a piece of the puzzle. I think, there may be, we're already seeing in terms of grants that were previously awarded or kind of on the precipice of awarding, in the process of getting awarded, some additional flexibility. Marisa mentioned changing them to operating funds. We've also seen sort of just tack on extensions already happening. So instead of having grantees go through the entire process of an application, just tacking on an additional amount of funding for an additional period of time. And then the biggie though is I think, there's just speed-wise, there's just a lot coming out now. So in terms of looking for funding, if something is rejected or just unable to meet emerging needs or declining revenues, that there needs to be a discipline and some concentration on looking for those new sources, seeing what's going on, who's your local United Way, who are your local community foundations, what are the national funds, what are the government funds. So a very kind of speedy and on top of it monitoring program is really going to be key for bridging some of those gaps.
Thanks, Allie. Marisa, you had something you wanted to add?
I do. I think at the foundation, the other resources that we have to deal with unfunded applications outside of the crisis situation, but even more relevant now, is if something is not funded from a competitive grant perspective or the crisis fund, then going to donor advised fund holders, some of our collaborative giving groups, and saying, here's a need that is very important in the community, knowing a donor's interest or a specific area of funding, would you take a look at this? And so I think that is another opportunity, not just, as well as passing, those applications to various funders that might have that niche better covered, is going to the donor advised fund holders and collaborative giving groups that have resources to support as well.
That's really helpful. I know like one of the challenges of that too is like, so how do we access a lot of those donor advised funds is kind of insider baseball. And so obviously knowing you has been very helpful in that regard. What advice would you give for folks who may not know that that's even available?
I would say that, I came from a nonprofit organization into the community foundation and really did learn a lot about the donor advised fund world. And I think that it's important to have that relationship with your community foundation as they're kind of a gatekeeper to donor advised fund holders. I think being communicative on your own marketing material and development material from a nonprofit perspective, saying, we are available to accept donor advised funds. And then it's really development team good practice to get to know your donors and understand who may be functioning in that way. So I think there's a pretty multifaceted approach to become an organization that is well known in the donor advice circle, and that also includes financial advisors. But a key into that is I think local community foundations.
Kind of tag into that too. So what kind of, and this goes to the entire panel, have you heard of any creative fundraising strategies that nonprofits are doing around our own community, around the nation, that you would like to just share here, or maybe even just give advice for today?
I'll share one that I know. I know particularly the arts community is having a difficult time. They're hit because many of their events are canceled. Artists may not have the type of resources or limited resources to things provided through Department of Workforce Solutions and whatnot. So I know lots of groups are doing virtual events with proceeds for those events going directly to the artists. And I think that's a really innovative way to not only create and connect community during this time. And again, lots of arts organizations have really important anchor communities in Albuquerque and beyond, but also provide a resource to move funding directly to artists. I know there's been several artist relief funds that I've seen, 516 with the Fulcrum Fund, Arts Hub, that are specifically trying to get relief money out to artists. Again, very easy application, but that's a limited resource pool. And so I think that's been really innovative for some nonprofits to work in that sphere and connect community while raising money for artists through those functions.
I'll pipe in with one I saw, which was for a shelter for animals, a pet shelter, and they, I think it was for $15. They should have done it for more, but they were having, you could send a picture, a photo of your own pet, and have one of the shelter staff draw the pet and email you back an image of their craft work. So some of the shelter employees were super talented and others not so much. So it was kind of a charming collection of drawings that they were able to basically handle electronically for everything and send back. And it definitely went viral. They had to actually shut down the fundraiser after a few days because they had too many orders, so to speak.
Something I saw years ago was an invitation to a non-event, and they had clever reasons. So you got the invitation, and then you had an RSVP, and there were different humorous excuses for why you weren't going to attend the event. And then it also had the amount you were going to give to not attend.
Cathy or Terry, do you have anything else you want to add to that one? No? Allie, this one is for you. How do you recommend nonprofits approach grant programming, including current grants and grant seeking?
We've talked a little bit about already how to manage current grants. To add a couple more thoughts, I would say sitting down with your team and looking over the grant agreements, just to get a feel for where you are in timelines, what deliverables might have been there, what adjustments might be made, and then thinking through with those awards, is there a need to sort of completely shift them over to operational funding? Is it just that you need a little more time? Is it that you need to adjust those deliverables perhaps? Or is it that the nature of your work is changing? So if, say, you have an after-school program, well, that program's not going to be operational for a little while, but what does that look like? Is that you maybe go virtual, or is it that the needs change, that the parents are starting to come to you asking, for support accessing social services? What does it look like that is coming through that may be related to that initial grant? So I think then you have those conversations with those funders, with those adjustments in mind. Probably good to have a couple options. So if maybe operational funding isn't a go, maybe an extension or a pivot in terms of the programming itself. I think one of the other things that is near term pretty important is figuring out who's going to be doing that monitoring that we just talked about. Looking at NMAG's site, looking at the Grant Plant site, looking at the site from Candid, and keeping an eye on those. One of the things to especially keep in mind on the federal side is federal grants are big and they take a lot of time. And they typically have an open cycle that's 30 to 90 days. Not only are we probably going to see those shortened down more towards the 30 side generally, but also passed a few weeks ago was a release that's allowing agencies to actually have a shorter timeline than 30 days. So I think becoming ready for those, making sure that your registrations are in order, that you have a lot of files at hand, that you're detecting those as quick as possible. And for some agencies, you might have freed up time because your fundraiser is not organizing that fundraiser, or you're not doing the operations. For others, there isn't a relief in terms of somebody's time freed up for monitoring. So maybe that's something that you move to your board, and a board member or volunteer that can really at least take a look at those and say, here's something new that popped up, so that it's not your staff having to do it. So then, like I said, kind of the preparedness, keeping an eye on those, and matching your needs. So I think that's the other piece, is not everything is best served by a grant, as well as I think everybody's probably having conversations within their nonprofits about what needs are coming up or where needs are bigger, but looking at those in terms of grant seeking and grant funds as well. And also probably picking up some of the slack where some of the other fundraising can't step in or is going to be reduced, those sorts of pieces. So the things we generally advise about, just more. Be prepared, plan, monitor the opportunities, see how they match. I think understand that flexibility issue, things that may not have been quite a fit before, maybe now, or there may be a little more slack in how those get executed, and definitely lots of communication with your funders.
That's really helpful. And I think just even within that, like doing more, I know I've heard from a few nonprofits, not only just here and across the country, that they've had to go down to like a skeleton crew. And they're just doing operations just like, this is it. This is my life right now. So it's really difficult sometimes to be able to see past what's right there in front of you. So what recommendations do y'all have for those that are just like right now, just in the weeds right now? How can they get the relief they need so they can actually pivot their operations and do more, get to that point where they can do more, Allie?
That's a question that's probably bigger than my expertise, but I think that partially comes back to a question about those existing awards of maybe you still are operating that program, but if you're able to free up with operational funds, that may make sense. Being strategic, I think looking in your own backyard for some of those just quick gap funding pieces. And then there's other things like if you're a member of the cooperative network, we may have a template or something that's going to save some time in terms of preparing those grants. of just kind of keeping on track of them and making that process a little bit easier than it might otherwise be, or asking, peer networks for that support. I think another one in general we talk about in terms of talking with funders, but would be especially important now is maybe figuring out like what are you really looking for, what really matters in this application, so you can focus limited time on really what is the key piece. So with federal grant makers, let's say it's something that's focused towards jobs in a recovery, then really kind of nailing those pieces that have to do with job creation or retainment, and kind of really speaking towards the highest priorities, because you may not have the ability to make everything within that application perfect with limited time and a stretched staff. So, but yeah, probably just looking for some quick hits first to just get some emergency funding in, and then looking a little bit longer term and being strategic about your time.
I was going to mention something on that front, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. I've been involved in several federal emergency recoveries for forest fires and, the natural gas outage in Espanola back in 2010, things like that. And, noticing what they have in the stimulus package, like on Head Start emergency staffing funds. There's going to be a lot of stuff out there to try to make you whole from this experience in a sense, and get you back to, where you are, where you need to be, and look back a little ways. And during those emergency events, when people like FEMA come in, or the SBA, the Small Business Administration, it's really important to track all of your expenditures, what you did with your staff, who went where, how much money you lost, keep your receipts, keep all your documentation, don't throw away your bank statements or whatever. Because that's all going to become necessary when you go into that state or federal agency and you say, we want to recover some of what we lost. You're going to have evidence for that. They're not going to take you just on your word. And it's heartbreaking to see people show up after an emergency and say, I don't have any documents, or I don't know how many staff hours we lost. I don't know the exact number, or I don't know what the revenue is that we lost, or whatever. So it's really important, as busy as people are, to take the time, find the extra minute or two just to track your stuff. And that will make you so much better prepared when you have to engage some of these agencies, because some of them will be grant applications, but some of them that you have an existing relationship with may just ask to extend terms on something, or go back and revisit some aspect of your letter of conditions that you signed or something. So having all your documents in order and being able to recreate the history of what happened, in a sense, is just very important. It's crucial.
That's helpful, Terry. I appreciate that. This question comes from one of our team too. How can people who cannot provide funding still help nonprofit organizations? This goes to everybody.
I think I can answer that a little bit. I think especially as you see nonprofits who are facing layoffs or staffing reduction in an hour level, it could be a great place for resource for donor calls, to take some kind of administrative work burden off of development staff to help move a fundraising agenda forward. So I think it's an important time for nonprofit organizations to tap into volunteer networks. And of course, thank goodness for Zoom and all the online virtual platforms, because we can stay connected in that way. But I think that if through a strategic volunteer plan, it's a good resource to move forward on your fundraising shifting during this time.
Thanks, Marisa. I appreciate that. Has anyone seen any nonprofits closing because of the governor's mandate in the last week?
Do you mean closing as in going out of business forever, or closing as in shuttering their operation temporarily?
Both.
I don't know of any that have gone out of business not to reopen. I have heard of several that have closed with the hope that they will reopen. And of course, whether they can or not in the future remains a question.
a hard reality we have to face too. I think I haven't seen anything in the stimulus package that would cover closures, unfortunately, and so we might be losing some nonprofits that we might not see for a while until they get back up on their feet. And so I mentioned before we started recording that a couple of food pantries actually have suspended their operations. They haven't closed, but I know that for them, this is going to be a struggle to get back up on their feet. And hopefully we can, hopefully we can all reach out to them and make sure that they have the resources they need so that they can. I just also want to be mindful of the time right now. It's almost 10 till 4. I want to ask our last question and get everyone on the panel to contribute to this one. So it is a scary time right now. And for a lot of folks, there doesn't seem like there's a way out at the moment. There's not a light at the end of the tunnel. This thing doesn't have an end to it just yet. So it can be a little scary. But, you know, there are still resources out there and communities out there that are helping each other. What would you like to impart for our nonprofit audience, for Impact and Coffee audience today? Just some closing thoughts. And in what ways do you think the nonprofit sector will recover from all of this? And I'll start with Marisa.
I think that, you know, nonprofits are integral to our community from a service perspective, from a cultural perspective, so much education. I mean, every single sector has nonprofit partners that are essential to the vibrancy of that sector in our community. So I think that it's not so much a question of when nonprofits will be able to, or if nonprofits will be able to recover, but when, and how supportive, you know, not only as a funder community, but as a community at large, we can be to all of them as they're going through very, very different situations. And so I think, again, the best thing we can do is listen, encourage those conversations, and really be flexible in how we meet the needs of these communities and these organizations on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Marisa. Zipporah.
Okay, so I would say to nonprofits, first of all, take a deep breath. Remember to look after yourself and your colleagues and your communities. And we will get through this and life won't look the same, but that's an opportunity as well as a challenge. And the opportunity is that we can advocate for a better world, for a better system. And I think that's where we need to be putting part of our energy, is reaching out to lawmakers and telling them why we're important, what we need, and how we want the future to be. We can craft this together.
Thanks, Zipporah. I appreciate that. Allie?
What immediately came to mind is sort of going to echo what Marisa and Zipporah just said. But I think my advice would be part of the conversation. So we've got sort of these immediate needs that involve probably talking to funders, reaching out to communities of support, volunteers, and communicating these emergent needs. And I think, though, when we look at fundraising, you know, what is then going to have to start happening is these prioritization and identification of leverage points to recover, to make systems that work better, all those sorts of pieces, that is going to be needed to have within sectors or within problems a little bit of common decision-making about what is a place that really needs to be addressed, or a problem or a gap or a solution. And being part of those conversations, talking with lawmakers, that's going to guide, you know, really how the next layers of investment happen. So for me, I know it's tough, head down, trying to deal with an immediate crisis, But I think being part of those conversations is how that you make sure as a nonprofit that whether it's state funding or foundation actions or federal pieces, that it's meeting the need of your constituents, your agency, and your communities.
Thanks, Allie. Cathy.
Yes. Nonprofits are so critical to all of us from birth to death. Throughout our life, we rely on the nonprofit sector, and I think this is a time to hone in on our stories of nonprofits, to say, what would it be like if we weren't around, if our organization didn't exist, and that this is really a time to craft the story about why it's important to support the organization and the sector in so many ways. So I think it's an opportunity right now.
Thanks, Cathy. I appreciate that. Terry, you're last, but you're certainly not least.
Well, I like what everybody has said thus far, and they all covered most of the bases. I would say that it's important that as much as nonprofits can, that they observe what's going on and think about how they're going to have to alter their approach. Whether we like it, we're all going to change from this and do things differently. The question is what are you going to do differently, and what is it going to look like? So the best that we can look around at the landscape and understand where we fit in. And the nonprofit I work with, the Grants Collective, will be talking about what we have to do differently now and how we approach stuff differently. And everybody has to do that. And if you look back at history over time, the nonprofits over the last 100 years or so that went through these major world events, either they changed their approach or they had a tough go of it. And so you really have to try your best to go with the flow and understand what's happening and make the changes, take some risks, try some new things out. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, how do we use this event to, in a sense, up our game to get better at what we do, to move New Mexico a little bit further than where it's been, and try out new things and new networks and new partnerships and all those types of things. I think there's, as sad as the event is, there's a lot of opportunity there in these times. So we need to all be thinking about what that opportunity is and how we meet it. Excellent last words.
And so with that, we'll close our panel. I just want to say a big, huge thank you to all 5 of you for joining us today. So in closing, so Impact and Coffee, again, happens the first 3 Tuesdays in the month. I don't know what our plans are for in April just yet. But we will make sure that we'll let everyone know about this video very soon. I also just want to plug the Grants Collective a little bit more too. So this conversation, I know that we've been talking about teeing up another conversation with other funders and with various activities that are happening around the state. And so I don't know who that person is, but they are welcome to be on this phone call. Hello. But we will have more information about when that virtual conversation is going to happen very soon. I also want to give a shout out to Lily Marie's Coffee. So she is a sponsor of Impact and Coffee, and she is a wonderful, wonderful local entrepreneur. If you get a chance, please, please, please make sure that you purchase her coffee there. It's really good. I think they have an online store. This is tea. It's not coffee. I actually don't drink coffee anymore. But please, please, please make sure that you support local businesses as we keep on going forward through this epidemic, or pandemic, excuse me. Does anyone else from the Impact and Coffee team have anything else they want to add? Don't think so. Okay. Well, with that, we'll close. We'll make sure that the video is up on social media by tomorrow, I believe at noon. And just a big shout out to every one of you. Thank you so much for taking the time today to be with us and be part of the panel. And we'll go from there.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everyone.
Thanks.